The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Hamilton County Courthouse as Dr. Michelle Carter adjusted her simple navy blazer. At 38 years old, she had spent the last decade building a reputation as one of the country's most respected courtroom specialists. Today was supposed to be just another evaluation day, but something felt different in the crisp autumn air. Michelle had deliberately chosen to dress modestly, a choice she always made during initial courthouse visits. Her pearl earrings were small, her makeup minimal, and her curly hair was pulled back neatly in a professional bun. A leather messenger bag hung across her body, containing her tablet, notebook, and the official documents that outlined her authority as a Supreme Court-appointed evaluator. As she climbed the courthouse steps, several lawyers rushed past her, their arms full of files and coffee cups. None of them gave her a second glance. Mitchell smiled to herself, knowing that anonymity was exactly what she needed for an accurate evaluation. After all, how could she assess the true day-to-day operations if everyone knew who she was? The security checkpoint came first. Mitchell placed her bag on the conveyor belt and waited patiently as the guard examined her items. "Purpose of visit?" he asked routinely, barely looking up from his screen. "Observing court proceedings," Michelle replied simply. It wasn't a lie. She just didn't mention that she would be doing so in an official capacity. The guard nodded and waved her through. Inside the building, Michelle consulted her phone's calendar. Courtroom 4B was her first stop of the day, where Judge Richard Thompson would be handling misdemeanor cases. She had read his file thoroughly the night before. 20 years on the bench, known for running a tight ship, and had a reputation for being particularly strict about courtroom conduct. As Michelle walked down the marble hallway, her sensible heels clicking against the floor, she began her mental checklist. She noticed the poorly marked directions to the courtrooms, the slightly crooked sign about cell phone policies, and the way the court clerk barely acknowledged people asking for directions. All of these observations went into quick notes on her phone, a practice that would soon create an unexpected situation. Finding courtroom 4B, Michelle slipped quietly through the heavy wooden doors. The room was already half full, with various defendants, lawyers, and family members seated in the gallery. She chose a spot in the middle row, perfect for observing both the judge's bench and the general proceedings. Around her, people fidgeted nervously, some whispering to their attorneys, others staring straight ahead. Mitchell noticed a young public defender struggling to organize his files while trying to comfort an elderly client. She made another note on her phone. The courthouse clearly needed better preparation areas for public defenders to meet with their clients. The bailiff's voice suddenly boomed through the room. "All rise. The Court of Hamilton County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Richard Thompson presiding." Everyone stood as Judge Thompson entered. He was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing his black robes with an air of authority that came from years of experience. Michelle observed his entrance carefully, noting how he barely looked at the gathered crowd as he took his seat. "Be seated," he commanded, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Michelle could see why he had a reputation for running a strict courtroom. Even the way he arranged his papers and adjusted his microphone spoke of someone who valued order and control above all else. As the first case was called, Michelle continued making notes on her phone, documenting everything from the judge's tone with defendants to the efficiency of the court officers. She had performed similar evaluations in hundreds of courtrooms across the country, but each one was unique. This particular morning, however, would prove to be more unique than most. Little did Michelle know that her simple act of taking notes on her phone, a practice she had done countless times before, was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose deep-seated biases and ultimately lead to meaningful changes in this courthouse. For now, though, she simply sat, observed, and documented, performing her job with the quiet professionalism that had become her trademark. The morning session had been running smoothly for about 45 minutes when everything changed. Michelle was in the middle of typing a note about Judge Thompson's efficient handling of a traffic violation case when she noticed his stern gaze fixed directly on her. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "Young lady in the blue blazer," Judge Thompson's voice cut through the courtroom like ice. "What do you think you're doing with that phone?" Michelle looked up calmly, her fingers stopping mid-sentence. The entire courtroom had gone silent, and all eyes were now on her. She began to reach for her credentials, but the judge wasn't finished. "In this courtroom," he continued, his voice rising with authority, We have strict rules about electronic devices. Surely you saw the signs posted throughout the building." He peered down at her over his wire-rimmed glasses, his expression a mixture of annoyance and disapproval. "Your Honor, I can explain," Michelle started, maintaining her professional tone. "There's nothing to explain," Judge Thompson interrupted. "The rules are clearly posted. I'm holding you in contempt of court. The fine will be $500. A few gasps could be heard from the gallery. The public defender from earlier looked up from his files, his eyes widening as he recognized Michelle from a legal conference last year. He started to stand, but Michelle gave him a subtle shake of her head. "Your Honor," Michelle tried again, her voice steady despite the tension. "If you would allow me just a moment to." "Make it $750, Judge Thompson declared, his face reddening slightly. "Would you like to try for an even $1,000? The court clerk shifted uncomfortably in her seat, watching the scene unfold. She had started pulling up the contempt of court paperwork on her computer, but was typing unusually slowly, as if hoping someone would interrupt this process. Michelle sat straighter in her seat, her hand still resting on her messenger bag where her Supreme Court credentials waited. She could see the assumptions playing across Judge Thompson's face, assumptions about who she was, what she was doing, and why she was there. Each passing second seemed to confirm his initial judgment. "Your Honor," she began one more time, her voice carrying a quiet authority that made several attorneys in the room turn their heads. "I believe we're having a misunderstanding that could be easily cleared up if—" "Ms." Judge Thompson paused, expecting her to fill in her name. "Dr. Carter," she supplied evenly. "Dr. Carter," he repeated, his tone making it clear he doubted the title. "Perhaps you think your education puts you above the rules of this court. The fine now stands at $1,000, and I'm quickly losing my patience with your continued defiance." The bailiff had begun moving toward Michelle's row, his hand resting on his belt. In the gallery, people were whispering now, some recording the scene on their phones, an irony that wasn't lost on Michelle. Just then, the heavy courtroom doors burst open. A woman in her 50s wearing a court administrator's badge rushed in, slightly out of breath. She hurried toward the judge's bench, a worried expression on her face. Behind her, 2 more court officials appeared in the doorway, looking concerned. The court administrator, Mrs. Patricia Jenkins, quickly made her way to the bench. Her face was flushed as she leaned in to whisper something in Judge Thompson's ear. Mitchell could see the exact moment the information registered. The judge's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. The courtroom remained silent, the tension now thick enough to cut with a knife. Judge Thompson's hands, which had been gripping his gavel tightly, slowly relaxed. He cleared his throat once, then again, his earlier confidence evaporating as he looked back at Michelle with new eyes. The next few moments would determine how this situation would unfold. Michelle sat calmly, her years of experience helping her maintain her composure. She had seen this scenario play out before in other courtrooms, though rarely in such a dramatic fashion. As Judge Thompson struggled to find his next words, Michelle knew this incident was about to become a powerful lesson in prejudice and presumption. The silence in courtroom 4B stretched for what felt like an eternity. Judge Thompson's face had lost its authoritative confidence, replaced by a look of dawning recognition and dismay. Mrs. Jenkins, the court administrator, stood awkwardly by the bench, her eyes darting between the judge and Dr. Carter. Finally, Judge Thompson cleared his throat. "Dr. Michelle Carter," he said, his voice notably different from his earlier tone. I understand you're here on behalf of the state Supreme Court's Judicial Review Board?" Michelle stood slowly, retrieving her credentials from her messenger bag. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm conducting a standard evaluation of courtroom procedures and efficiency across the district." Her voice remained professional and measured, showing no sign of triumph or resentment. The attorneys in the room exchanged knowing looks. Several of them had already pulled out their phones, no doubt sharing the morning's events with colleagues. The irony of them now using their phones without comment from the judge wasn't lost on anyone. "I believe," Michelle continued, her calm voice carrying through the silent courtroom, "that we just witnessed a perfect example of why these evaluations are necessary." She paused, looking around the room, "and why they're conducted anonymously." Judge Thompson's face flushed again, but this time with embarrassment rather than anger. The gavel he had been clutching so confidently earlier sat untouched on his bench. The bailiff, who had been approaching Michelle just moments ago, now stood awkwardly in the middle of the aisle, unsure whether to return to his post. "Dr. Carter," Judge Thompson began, "I want to extend my sincerest." He trailed off as Michelle raised her hand slightly. "Your Honor," she said firmly but kindly, "I suggest we continue with the day's proceedings. We can discuss this matter during the lunch recess. After all," she added, gesturing to the packed gallery, "these citizens have taken time out of their day to be here." The judge nodded quickly, grateful for the professional courtesy she was extending. "Yes, of course." He shuffled his papers, trying to regain his composure. "Mr. Rodriguez," he called out, his voice slightly shaky, "please proceed with your case." As the young public defender stood to present his case, Michelle resumed her seat and continued taking notes on her phone. This time, no one objected. In fact, several people in the gallery had trouble focusing on the proceedings, their eyes constantly drifting back to the composed woman in the blue blazer. Throughout the next hour, Judge Thompson's demeanor had notably changed. His usual sharp tone with defendants softened. He listened more carefully to the public defender's arguments. When a young mother struggled to quiet her baby, he showed patience instead of his typical stern warning about courtroom disturbance. Michelle documented everything. Her fingers moved swiftly across her phone screen, recording not just the obvious changes in the judge's behavior, but the subtle shifts in the entire courtroom's atmosphere. The court clerk now sat up straighter at her desk. The bailiff showed more courtesy when directing people where to stand. Even the court reporter seemed to type with extra diligence. As the morning session neared its lunch break, Mrs. Jenkins returned to the courtroom. She quietly placed a folder on Michelle's bench, the courthouse's official policies and procedures manual, along with visitor logs from the past 6 months. It was a peace offering of sorts, an acknowledgement that the morning's events had sparked an immediate desire to cooperate. Michelle accepted the folder with a polite nod, though she had already reviewed all these documents thoroughly before her visit. The real story here wasn't in any manual or policy document. It was in the visible transformation she had witnessed over the past hour, all sparked by a single moment of confrontation and revelation. As Judge Thompson called for the lunch recess, Michelle gathered her belongings slowly. She could feel his eyes on her from the bench, no doubt dreading their upcoming conversation. But what he didn't know yet was that this uncomfortable moment would become a turning point, not just for his courtroom, but for the entire district's approach to judicial conduct. The judge's private lunchroom was quiet except for the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. Judge Thompson sat at the large oak table, his robes now hanging on a nearby coat rack, leaving him in a plain white shirt and dark tie. His usual lunch, a sandwich from the courthouse cafe, sat untouched before him. Across the table, Dr. Michelle Carter was reviewing her morning notes, her tablet propped up against a water glass. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mrs. Jenkins, the court administrator, sat nervously at the end of the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. "Dr. Carter," Judge Thompson finally broke the silence, his voice much softer than it had been in the courtroom. "I want to apologize for my behavior this morning. It was completely unacceptable." Michelle looked up from her tablet, her face professional but not unkind. "Your Honor, before you continue, I'd like to share some numbers with you." She turned her tablet around. "In the past year, I've evaluated 78 courtrooms across 12 states. Would you like to know how many times I've been threatened with contempt charges while doing my job?" The judge's face grew pale. I imagine it hasn't happened often." 3 times, Michelle said clearly. "All 3 times, the judges made assumptions about me based on my appearance. All 3 times, they acted before asking for my credentials." She paused, letting the information sink in. "And all 3 times, there were white male judges dealing with a black female professional." Mrs. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Michelle continued, her voice remaining calm and factual. "What makes today's incident particularly noteworthy, Your Honor, is that you have a sign in your courtroom that reads 'Justice is blind.'" Judge Thompson's shoulders slumped. 20 years on the bench, and he had never felt more ashamed. "I've always prided myself on being fair and impartial," he said quietly. "I've given lectures about judicial integrity. I've mentored young judges. And yet today, Michelle finished for him, you showed us all that unconscious bias can affect even those who believe they're above it. She pulled out another document from her bag. Did you know that your court has a higher rate of contempt charges against minorities compared to neighboring districts? The judge's head snapped up. That's impossible. I keep careful track of. The numbers don't lie, Your Honor, Michelle interrupted gently, sliding the report across the table. But here's the interesting part. I don't believe you're doing it consciously. That's what makes bias so dangerous. It works in the background of our minds, affecting our decisions in ways we don't even notice. Mrs. Jenkins finally spoke up. What happens now, Dr. Carter? Will this incident be in your final report to the Supreme Court? Michelle took a sip of water before answering. That depends largely on what happens next. She turned to face Judge Thompson directly. Your Honor, this morning's incident gives us two choices. We can treat it as a shameful moment that goes into a report and damages your reputation, or we can use it as a catalyst for real change in this courthouse. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his lunch completely forgotten. What kind of change are we talking about? Comprehensive bias training for all court staff, Michelle began, pulling up a new document on her tablet. Regular reviews of contempt charges and sentencing patterns. A new procedure for verifying the identity and purpose of all courtroom observers before taking action against them. She paused. And most importantly, your public commitment to learning from this experience and helping other judges do the same. The old clock continued its steady ticking as Judge Thompson considered her words. 20 years of pride and authority were battling with today's harsh lesson in humility. Finally, he straightened in his chair, some of his judicial dignity returning, but this time tempered with wisdom. Dr. Carter, he said firmly, where do we begin? Word spread through the courthouse like wildfire. By the time the afternoon session began, every clerk, bailiff, and attorney had heard about the morning's events in Courtroom 4B. What happened next surprised everyone even more. Judge Thompson returned to his courtroom a changed man. As he took his place at the bench, the usual atmosphere of rigid formality was replaced by something different, something more human. Dr. Carter sat in the same spot as before, still taking notes, but now her presence carried a different weight. Before we resume today's cases, the judge announced, his voice clear but humbled, I have something to say to everyone present. The courtroom fell silent, all eyes fixed on him. This morning, I made a serious error in judgment. I allowed my preconceptions to cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I failed to uphold the very principles of justice I'm sworn to protect. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Michelle continued typing, but a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. Mrs. Jenkins, standing near the door, nodded approvingly. Starting today, Judge Thompson continued, we're implementing new procedures in this courtroom. First, no one will be held in contempt without being given a full opportunity to explain themselves. Second, we will be tracking all our contempt charges and reviewing them monthly for any signs of bias. The public defender from the morning session sat up straighter, his expression a mixture of surprise and hope. Several other attorneys exchanged meaningful looks. Throughout the afternoon, the changes were immediately visible. When a young Hispanic man appeared for a traffic violation, Judge Thompson listened patiently to his explanation about a family emergency, something he might have dismissed just that morning. When an elderly white woman spoke out of turn, he gently reminded her of courtroom protocol instead of immediately threatening a fine. Dr. Carter's fingers moved steadily across her phone screen, documenting every interaction. But now, instead of recording problems, she was noting positive changes. The bailiff had started greeting everyone with the same respectful tone, regardless of their appearance. The court clerk was taking extra time to explain procedures to confused defendants. During a brief recess, Michelle overheard two veteran attorneys talking near the water fountain. In 20 years, one whispered, I've never seen anything like this. Thompson's actually listening to people. Maybe we all needed this wake-up call, the other replied, glancing at Michelle with newfound respect. By late afternoon, news of the changes had spread to other courtrooms. Judges from neighboring courts found excuses to stop by and observe. Some came with skepticism, others with curiosity, but all left with something to think about. As the day went down, Judge Thompson handled his final case, a young black woman charged with a minor parking violation. Just that morning, he might have treated her with automatic sternness. Instead, he listened carefully to her explanation about unclear signage, even asking the city representative if similar complaints had been received from that area. Case dismissed, he announced, after learning there had indeed been several similar complaints. And I'm recommending a review of the signage in that parking zone. The young woman's relief was visible, but what struck Michelle most was the lack of surprise from the gallery. In just one day, the atmosphere in courtroom 4B had shifted from fear to respect. As the bailiff called out, "Court is adjourned," Judge Thompson turned to where Michelle sat. She gave him a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement. They both knew this was just the beginning. The real test would come in the days and weeks ahead. Would these changes stick? Would other judges follow suit? Would the statistical disparities in contempt charges and sentencing begin to even out? But for now, something significant had happened. A moment of bias had been transformed into an opportunity for growth. As people filed out of the courtroom, there was a sense that they had witnessed not just a change in procedure, but a change in perspective. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had shown that change was possible, even in the most traditional of institutions. 1 week after the incident, Judge Thompson's courtroom had become the talk of the legal community. Lawyers, judges, and court staff from neighboring counties were coming to observe the changes taking place. At the center of it all, Dr. Michelle Carter continued her evaluation, watching as her recommendations turned into reality. On this particular morning, the judge had organized the first mandatory bias training session for all courthouse staff. The large conference room was packed with people, judges in their casual clothes instead of robes, clerks with notebooks ready, bailiffs sitting alongside public defenders. The usual hierarchy of the courthouse had temporarily dissolved. "I never thought I'd see Judge Thompson sitting in a training session," whispered one veteran clerk to another. "Usually, he's the one giving lectures." But there he was, in the front row, taking notes as Dr. Carter stood at the podium. She had agreed to conduct this first training session herself, understanding the importance of getting it right from the start. "Bias isn't always about obvious discrimination," Michelle explained, clicking to a new slide. "Sometimes it's as subtle as how quickly we lose patience with someone who doesn't match our expectations of what a professional looks like." Her eyes met Judge Thompson's, who nodded in understanding. The presentation included real examples from their own courthouse, with names and identifying details changed. There were graphs showing the patterns in contempt charges, fine amounts, and sentencing decisions. The numbers told a story that many in the room had never noticed before. During the break, Judge Thompson approached Michelle near the coffee station. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "I've been reviewing my past cases from the last 5 years. The patterns are eye-opening." Michelle nodded. "Recognition is the first step, Your Honor. What matters now is what we do with this awareness." Back in the session, Michelle introduced a new system for tracking courtroom decisions. Each judge would receive monthly reports showing their patterns in sentencing, contempt charges, and fine amounts, broken down by race, gender, and economic status. The data would be reviewed quarterly by a diverse committee of legal professionals. "This isn't about pointing fingers," Michelle assured the nervous-looking crowd. "It's about giving us tools to check our own blind spots." Some of the older judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Judge Thompson spoke up. "A week ago, I would have said I didn't need these tools," he admitted to his colleagues. "I would have sworn that I treated everyone exactly the same. Now I know that believing you're unbiased isn't the same as actually being unbiased." His words carried weight. If Judge Thompson, known for his rigid adherence to tradition, could embrace these changes, others could too. After the training, Michelle walked through the courthouse corridors, observing the small but significant changes already taking place. New signs had been posted explaining courtroom procedures in multiple languages. The public defender's office had been given a proper meeting room for client consultations. The security staff had undergone additional training on respectful interaction. In the main lobby, she overheard a conversation between 2 court officers. "Did you notice how different it feels lately?" one asked. "People aren't as scared to come to court anymore." "Yeah," replied the other, "and Judge Thompson actually smiled yesterday, thought I was seeing things." Michelle smiled to herself as she made notes on her tablet. Change was happening, not just in procedures but in people's attitudes. The incident that could have been a scandal had instead become a catalyst for transformation. Later that afternoon, she sat in Judge Thompson's chambers, reviewing the day's progress. The judge had replaced his intimidating desk with a round table, a small but symbolic change in how he wanted to interact with others. "Dr. Carter," he said, looking at the training materials spread between them, "I keep thinking about how differently this could have gone if I'd stayed defensive that first day." "The mark of a good judge," Michelle replied, "isn't never making mistakes. It's what they do after realizing they've made one." 1 month had passed since the incident in Courtroom 4B, and Dr. Michelle Carter found herself standing at a podium in the state judicial conference. The large hall was filled with judges, attorneys, and court administrators from across the state. In the front row, Judge Thompson sat with perfect posture, a proud smile on his face. What happened in Hamilton County Courthouse wasn't just about one judge and one court evaluator, Michelle began, her voice carrying through the crowded room. It was about recognizing that even our best intentions can be undermined by unconscious bias. The audience listened intently as she shared the story. Many had already heard versions of it. The tale had spread through legal circles like wildfire. But hearing it directly from the people involved made it real in a way gossip couldn't match. Judge Thompson took the stage next, standing tall despite his nervousness. "A month ago, I was that judge who thought he knew everything about running a courtroom," he admitted, earning knowing chuckles from his colleagues. "Today, I'm here to tell you that I've learned more in the past month than in my previous 20 years on the bench." He clicked to the first slide, showing the dramatic changes in his courtroom statistics. Contempt charges had dropped by 60%. The racial disparity in fine amounts had nearly disappeared. Public satisfaction scores had risen significantly. "But the numbers only tell part of the story," he continued. "The real change is in how people feel when they enter our courthouse." The presentation included video interviews with court users. A Hispanic mother spoke about feeling heard for the first time. A young black law student described how the atmosphere had shifted from fear to respect. Even the courthouse maintenance staff reported feeling more valued and included. During the lunch break, Michelle watched as judges from other districts surrounded Judge Thompson, eager to learn more about implementing similar changes in their own courtrooms. The incident that could have ended his career had instead made him a reluctant pioneer for judicial reform. "Dr. Carter," called out Judge Maria Rodriguez from Central District, "we'd like to start these training sessions in our courthouse. Would you be willing to help us set them up?" Before Michelle could answer, 3 more judges joined the conversation, all expressing similar interest. She smiled, remembering how different things had looked just a month ago. Back at the podium, Michelle shared the practical steps they had taken. "Change doesn't have to be complicated," she explained. "Sometimes it's as simple as asking ourselves one question before making any decision. Would I handle this differently if the person in front of me looked different?" The afternoon session turned into an impromptu workshop as judges shared their own experiences with bias and brainstormed solutions. Judge Thompson's vulnerability had opened the door for others to admit their own mistakes and concerns. "I probably made similar assumptions," admitted Judge Williams from the Eastern District. "I just never had such a clear wake-up call." By the end of the day, 17 courthouses had committed to implementing the Hamilton County model. Mrs. Jenkins, who had traveled with them to the conference, was busy scheduling training sessions and sharing their new procedural guidelines. As they packed up their materials, Judge Thompson turned to Michelle. "You know, when you first came to evaluate our court, I thought it was just another bureaucratic requirement. I never imagined it would lead to all this." Michelle smiled as she watched groups of judges still deep in discussion about reform. "Sometimes the best changes come from our most uncomfortable moments," she replied. Outside the conference hall, a young black judicial clerk approached them shyly. "Judge Thompson, Dr. Carter," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. Your story. It gave me hope that things really can change." As they walked to their cars in the evening light, Michelle reflected on how far they'd come. The incident in Courtroom 4B could have ended with just an apology and some awkward memories. Instead, it had sparked a movement that was spreading across the state's judicial system, one courthouse at a time. 6 months had passed since that fateful morning in Courtroom 4B. Dr. Michelle Carter stood once again at the entrance of the Hamilton County Courthouse, but this time, everything was different. The same security guard who had barely glanced at her during her first visit now greeted her with a warm smile and respectful nod. "Good morning, Dr. Carter. Here for the 6-month review?" Michelle nodded, returning his smile. The courthouse had changed in both small and big ways. New signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. A help desk staffed by trained volunteers assisted confused citizens. The previously stark hallways now displayed artwork from local schools, making the space feel more welcoming. As she walked toward Courtroom 4B, Michelle passed Mrs. Jenkins, who was training a new court administrator from another county. Our contempt rates are down 70%, Mrs. Jenkins was explaining proudly. And the satisfaction surveys, well, you wouldn't believe the difference. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thompson was handling a complex case involving a young man who had missed several court dates. 6 months ago, it would have been an automatic warrant. Today, the judge listened patiently as the man explained about his 2 jobs and unreliable transportation. Mr. Rivera, Judge Thompson said, his tone firm but understanding, I appreciate you being honest with us. Let's see if we can work out a schedule that doesn't conflict with your work hours. He turned to the court clerk. Please provide Mr. Rivera with information about our new transportation assistance program. Michelle sat in her usual spot, taking notes. But unlike her first evaluation, she was now documenting successes rather than problems. The changes they had implemented had spread far beyond this single courtroom. 23 other courthouses across the state had adopted their training program. The state Supreme Court was considering making it mandatory for all judicial districts. During the lunch break, Judge Thompson hosted a monthly feedback session in the jury room. Court staff, attorneys, and even regular citizens were invited to share their thoughts on the recent changes. Mitchell watched as the judge, once known for his rigid authority, listened carefully to everyone's suggestions. Remember when we were all terrified to speak up? One veteran public defender whispered to his colleague. Now look at us, having lunch with the judge and actually being heard. The afternoon session brought a special moment. A young black woman, recently graduated from law school, was being sworn in as the courthouse's newest public defender. As she took her oath, Michelle noticed how different the audience looked compared to 6 months ago. More diverse, more engaged, more hopeful. After the ceremony, Judge Thompson approached Michelle with a familiar folder in his hands. It was her original evaluation report from 6 months ago, its pages now worn from frequent reference. I keep this in my chambers, he admitted, as a reminder of how one moment can change everything. He opened the folder to show her his handwritten notes in the margins, tracking their progress on each recommendation. You know, Michelle said, reviewing the notes, when I started doing these evaluations, most people saw them as just another bureaucratic requirement. But you turned it into something meaningful. The judge shook his head. No, Dr. Carter. You turned my mistake into something meaningful. I could have just apologized and gone back to my old ways. You showed us how to make real change. As the day drew to a close, Michelle sat in the now empty courtroom, finishing her final report. The statistics were impressive: reduced disparities in sentencing, higher satisfaction rates, fewer appeals. But the numbers couldn't capture the real transformation she had witnessed. A group of law students toured the courthouse, part of a new program to encourage diversity in the legal profession. She overheard their guide, the same bailiff who had once approached her threateningly, explaining the courthouse's commitment to equal justice. 6 months ago, he told them, we learned that justice isn't just about following rules. It's about seeing people, really seeing them, for who they are. Michelle closed her laptop and gathered her things. Her work here was largely done, but its impact would continue. As she walked out of Courtroom 4B for the last time, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of recognition.